There are many amazing reasons to travel to Japan, but finding good deals on Pokemon cards is not one of them. The Pokemon Worlds event is coming up in August in Yokohama, Japan, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who are very excited to go to Japan for the first time, go and see Tokyo, do some shopping, find maybe some Pokemon cards. But I wanted to give you a bit of a recap of my experience going there in November with the primary focus of trying to find Pokemon card stores and pick up Pokemon cards and purchase Pokemon cards, and why when I was there, I didn't buy a single Pokemon card. There's 4 different points we're going to talk about in this video. One of them is how much modern I saw versus how much vintage I saw, what the condition of a lot of the vintage cards were, the price of those cards, whether it was modern or vintage, and kind of the difficulty of communication and some of the barriers that were in place that made shopping a little bit more difficult for Pokemon cards. First, I want to just say, you might be under the impression that in certain parts of Tokyo, wherever you walk, there's going to be a card store on every corner. That's kind of true. There were moments where you're just walking around Akihabara, which is kind of the nerd capital of the world, and there is literally card shops or cards in crane games or card gacha, or it's literally everywhere. It's littered all across Akihabara. It was also very prominent in Shibuya. So yeah, I mean, there are certain parts of Tokyo where you walk and every other store has some sort of trading cards or some sort of collectibles in that store. It's pretty awesome. But once you get in those stores, it's a bit of a different story. Let's talk first about modern cards versus vintage cards and which ones I saw the most. I would say that I went to a bunch of different card stores. I went to probably 30 or 40 some different card stores in Tokyo, and then a few different card stores in Kyoto when I was there. And I'll tell you, it is 90%, 95% modern. Most of the stores, you could tell, either are just carrying modern because it's probably a lot more liquid than the vintage, or they're new stores, like they newly opened, and so the stuff that they can get their hands on right now is modern product. But most of what you're going to see, 90 to 95% of the cards in the card stores is going to be modern product. That really depends on the store. There are some stores that have been around, you could tell, for a long time, like Mandarake. That place definitely had a lot more vintage than it did modern. But places like Card Rush or most of the other places in Tokyo all were carrying primarily modern Pokemon cards. For a lot of you guys, that might not be a problem because maybe you're primarily more into modern right now than you are into vintage. So for you, that might be a plus. For me, I was looking for a lot of mid-era stuff, some WotC stuff, some older stuff, and there's just not a lot available in the actual stores in Japan or in Tokyo, or the stores at least that I went to. Next, let's talk about condition. So a lot of the vintage stuff that I did see, I was very excited to, take a look at what was available and see like what sorts of condition I was going to experience. Like what was the overall sort of condition of a lot of these vintage cards in these shops? What can I expect going into these shops and seeing condition? And I was not impressed. A lot of the cards, when you walk in, you're shopping around, you can only see the front of them. So when you call someone over to help you and you take a look at a few of the cards, you start to see that a lot of the cards are light to moderate play. And a lot of the prices can look fairly attractive on some of this vintage stuff. That's because once you turn that card around, you're gonna see that bend, that crease, or a lot of whitening around the edges. And that was definitely a trend. That was every store that I went to that had vintage product, whether it was a secondhand shop, whether it was a card store. You take a look at the backs of the cards, and it's just, you're not gonna grade anything from a lot of these stores, because a lot of these stores light play, maybe near mint if you're lucky, moderate play a lot of the times. It's just not going to happen. You're not going to find mint vintage Pokemon. Let's talk about price. This was a bit of a problem. A lot of the high value vintage cards were priced as their like expected PSA equivalent. So if the store thought the card was going to need a PSA 8, PSA 9, PSA 10, it was priced in to the actual price, which was unfortunate, because then that kind of means that there's no room to make money on that card because, it's priced in. But the best way that I can kind of explain pricing is obviously going to vary from store to store. There were some stores that were better on pricing than others. The best way that I can kind of illustrate how much higher, and I feel like this was kind of across the board, was the Pokemon Go Radiant Charizard. So Pokemon Go Radiant Charizard, if you go on Buy, you can find them between $10 and $20, probably hovering around like the $15 range. and that would be about 2,000 yen probably. Now, in some of the stores that I went to, in most of the stores that I went to, that particular card would be between 3,500 to 4,000 yen. So you're looking at basically double the price of what you could find the card for on Buy or at Card Rush at most of these other stores, which, I mean, obviously you're not going to buy a card. Like me knowing that I can buy that card on Buy for 15 bucks, I'm not going to buy that card for $32, $35 at a card store just because I'm in Japan. And a lot of the reason why I didn't buy any cards, any singles when I was there was because of the combination of condition and price. One quick thing before we move on to the communication part of this, I just want to say that there is kind of this sentiment, I feel like, between people here that kind of say that like Japanese people don't grade cards like PSA or whatever. That's not true. I actually saw a lot of graded cards when I was there. Probably every shop that I went into had a section of PSA graded cards. I didn't see a lot of CGC, obviously, because PSA has an office in Japan where they basically middleman for Japanese people. So Japanese people who live in Japan can send to PSA. PSA sends to America. They get graded. They get it back. It's like an official middleman for PSA in Japan. There was definitely a lot of PSA graded cards when I was there. It's not just a Western thing to grade your cards. They are grading cards over there too. They might not be grading it as much, but they are, and I assume that if PSA in Japan becomes more successful, that market is just going to grow and grow and grow more over there as well. Last but not least, I want to talk about communication and kind of some of the barriers that you may expect when you go into these shops. Obviously, I would never expect going to a country where their primary language is not English. I would never expect them to speak English, and I would never get frustrated if they didn't speak English, because that's just stupid, okay? I'm more frustrated for my lack of Japanese and my lack of ability to be able to communicate with the people in the stores. But let's talk about some of the barriers we had. So the first barrier is every single card is locked in a case. So that's good for like security and stuff for the store, but it's tough because you can't see the backs of any cards, and you can only see the front of the cards. And a lot of the fronts of Japanese cards look great. It's not until you turn them over that you start to see the problems with them. While you're window shopping, you can't really get a good idea of the condition of the card until you ask for help or call someone over to help you. Now, this is kind of an awkward thing, not only because of the communication barrier, but a lot of these stores, there's only maybe 1 or 2 employees working in them, and they're busy. Every single store I went into was super busy of people looking at cards and needing help and everything. So you may sit there for a while before you're able to get someone to come over. Or if you do get someone to come over, you're taking up like 50% or 100% of the current workforce in the store to help you. And if you want to look at like 10 different cards, that can take a lot of time. And then on top of that, if you don't buy anything, it feels kind of awkward and feels like you just wasted kind of this clerk's time. And I know that's more of like a personal thing. I'm sure a lot of people wouldn't care. They're just like, well, yeah, I want to look at all these cards, so who cares whether or not I'm taking up this guy's time. But it does kind of suck when you have someone standing there with you, when they're showing you all the cards, when they're pulling stuff out, and then at the end of the day, you're like, yeah, I don't want any of that. It does really kind of make you feel a little bad about taking all that time, you know, away from possible other customers that might actually buy shit, and you're not buying anything. So it made me feel a little bad when I encountered that. Lastly, I just want to say, because I got duped into this a little bit when I first went to Japan, but I have a buddy that lives in Japan. He's lived there for a long time now. And when I was first going to visit there, he said basically that if you're in the major cities, English is totally fine. For the most part, that's true. For the most basic of communication. So a lot of the people in Japan, they understand English in regards to what they're doing. So if you go to McDonald's, they're going to understand the menu in English, right? Because they encounter it more often. If you go to a card store, they might understand the Pokemon names in English, or card, or, you know, condition, or those types of things in English, because that's what they're doing. So as long as the conversations are close to what those people actually are doing, you're gonna do fine. And I would say that for the most part, like, remove like 80% of the shit in your sentence too. Like, keep it basic. The experience really gave me more of an appreciation for Buy. As much as I hate Buy and the buyer protection of Buy, which is basically non-existent, this experience really gave me a lot more appreciation for how smooth Buy is. And even though you might get scammed once in a while with no actual recourse to be able to do anything about it, it's a much bigger inventory, and it's much better prices, and a lot of the conditions you're able to find if you really put the work in on Buy are definitely worth doing that over traveling to Japan to try and find Pokemon cards.